Guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Bind, and today we're going to create a brush in Photoshop. So if you have seen any of my tutorials, you probably heard me talking about brushes before. And what I usually say is that you don't need a million brushes. In fact, if you are good at making decisions, painting, rendering, you can paint a very compelling image just with a round brush. But of course, at one point, and that's usually later in the videos, or also kind of like the video I did about the detail process, right? That's when you bring out some brushes that are a little bit more fancy and carry some texture, or have some special use cases, let's say. So right away, a lot of these things I'm going to show you today, you can also apply them in any Photoshop clone program like Clip Studio or the likes. So there really shouldn't be a problem with that, because they basically all use the blueprint of Photoshop. But without further ado, let's jump into a canvas. So first thing we do is we open a new canvas, and the size of that is not too critical, but there is one thing, and that it cannot be too low on pixel count, right? So I'm going with a 3000 by 2000. Gives me a nice size here. And then yeah, depending on your preference, if you don't like the white background like me, you can quickly just put any tone in the background, but I recommend to stay in black and white. And the reason for that is, as you will find out very soon, that all the brush tips, shapes, cliches, right, are basically black and white cliches that you then can later apply any color to it. But first things first. So we need another layer that is not a background layer here. And that is because you cannot bake a background into a brush tip. When I'm referring to a brush tip, what do I mean by that? Now let's clear that up right now. So as you can see here, over in the brush library, there's several brushes, and they usually have a little preview. And let's take a very obvious shape, right? You can see this is the cliche of the brush. That is the outline of the shape, same way as with a selection, right? So I just put a strong color. Also be sure that you're always at 100% opacity. I lay it down, you will have this same brush tip come out. This is what I mean when I'm talking about a brush tip, because how do brushes work? Brushes, essentially, they work like you can see over here in the brush creator, let's call it. You can bring that up with F5 on your keyboard, or let's see, yeah, it's actually this one. Your presets are your brushes, and then the brush, I'll call this the brush creator, because in there you have all of the specifications that you might want to set. So when you go in there, and it doesn't matter if this window is integrated in your UI or it's just free floating, it looks the same. But if you go in there, the first top navigation will be your brush tip shape. And you can see that what Photoshop means by the brush tip is what I just laid out to you. It is one iteration of the cliche that you defined as a brush tip. So, and you can see that there's then certain specifications to that. First is the size, and the size used to get baked in as a brush, at least in this version of Photoshop. I think in the newer versions you have an option to not bake it in, but that doesn't really matter. So you can rotate the orientation of that tip, and also you can set the spacing, because any brush, and let's take a round to demonstrate this. This is my usual hard round with a minimum spacing of 1%. And this, I use it to just paint lines or shapes that I want to be 100% opaque, right? So no transparency here. Here also barely any transparency, but really on a tip like this. And it also, you see how it doesn't have any of those boxes ticked barely. But we'll get into that in a second. So first, how does the brush work? The brush is just iterations spaced out of that same cliche repeating over and over again. That's really all it is, and has been since the very beginning of digital painting, right? So what happens is that via certain specifications you can mask this repetition and alter it and make it, how would you say, iterative, right? So that every repetition becomes something different. So in a round brush, there is no real use to be super fancy. You just put it down where it's appearing smooth with the repetition, and then you're good to go, right? So that's the most basic brush is, I would say, traditional geometric shape that just repeats, okay? In this case, a circle. So let's forget about the circle for a second, because what you want and what I'm showing you today is how to make your own brush. And that is much more, of course, like that brush that I used over here, right? So a fancy brush. Now, how do we get to something like this? If you have never heard about this might shock you a little bit, but basically you just paint the brush. Okay, so yeah, this is, so let's make an example of this. You need your empty layer that has no background, right? That's number one. And also remember that when you now lay down shapes on the canvas, you should have a goal. What does the brush resolve for you? Okay, so let's make a first brush, and the first brush will be a granular pencil-like brush, okay? So what do you need for that? If we were to zoom in, we would see that the pencil produces little specks, and then because of the nature of how the paper is not perfectly smooth, it will create inconsistencies, right? So in digital painting, of course, at least in Photoshop, we do not usually simulate paper, so therefore, and also, yeah, you might say with a filter, but that's really not what you want. What you want is it to come out of the brush just like that. So what we need to pay attention to is that now you might think, yeah, I'm creating a pencil, and then you make tiny shapes. That's not good. The reason why that is not good is because your resolution is limited, remember. So the resolution of this canvas, if I make a tiny brush, it will just have a few pixels in total. So the pixel that you now create, the pixel amount that you now create, is the highest quality your brush will ever get, because your brush is not a vector graphic. So it's not unlimited scalable, right? We are operating in pixel logic here. So therefore, we want to make a nice big cliche so that we have quality. We can make the brush bigger without getting pixelation or like this nasty bilinear smoothing or anything like that. So what we do is I'm creating little speckles now. And you can do this any way you want. You can do this by, yeah, just the way I'm doing it, by painting them with a lasso tool and then coloring them, or you can just take any brush you want and just paint them. The important thing is that you have no background, because later, if we convert this to a brush tip, what you now see is what you will get in every repetition. It's fairly simple. So now, make this a little bit not so regular. And then of course what you can also do, and in this case I'm just painting the brush tip just with brush and eraser, because you can also erase from those shapes, of course. Don't like what you see. Maybe one shape is too big for your taste. So I don't know how this will come out, because it's always a little bit of a surprise in the end. But what I know by experience is that if you want a texture brush or a brush that is kind of chaotic, you have to make it non-symmetric, right? That helps a lot. So I will for now leave it at that. This will become the brush tip of something of an organic pencil stroke. That's at least my goal. We'll see how that turns out in a minute. So then what you do, excuse me, then what you do is you need to mark an area, and you need to do it on that same layer. So in this case you can create any shape, rectangular shape, but I will strongly recommend you to hold down Shift so that you're sure that it's a perfect square. And why is that important? The reason why that is important is because if you select anything else, anything other than a square, it will secretly, once you define it, cut away from it and change it into a square without your control anyways. So because the goal is that the brush cliche does need to have the same height as it has a width, right? It's just not filled out in that case. Then in the case of it being a very long cliche or very high one, right? So that I always use the perfect square to define it, because then I also see when it is in the middle, right? And that's how I want it to come out. So once you have that, you're almost done creating your brush. Well, you're almost done creating your brush tip. That would be more accurate to say. So in the edit menu, you can select here, define brush preset. And that is what I want you to do. If you click that, magic appears and you will have a thumbnail of that cliche with a number, and then you can give it a name. And now we'll call this reach around for the keyboard, pencil test. Doesn't really matter how you call it. I will tell you why in a second. So what does the number mean? The number is total pixel count squared. So that is you should not go a lot higher than this, because imagine if you go double or triple that later with a brush, that just means it blows up the brush like you would a JPEG, right? And you will get blurry and or pixelated, right? So now you hit that, what immediately happened here, it showed up on the bottom of my brushes. So now, and it also has that same name, I'm just not having names displayed in my brushes because I don't need that. I'd rather have a better overview, so that's why it does not have that. But if you go into the brush selection, there you have it. You even have a preview now of the stroke, which is useless because we did not define any specifications yet, but there you would have it. So now I would for now leave this layer alone, create a new layer to see what we've done. And we have done something like this. So this is pretty terrible because I made a mistake, right? I was already thinking that when I had the preview right now. What was my mistake? Mistake is this, very simple, guys. I usually have a white background, so the background color got baked into this. So what we should have done is this. Define the brush preset, and now you can see that it's no longer boxed, and also the pixel count slightly changes because it goes to the borders of those shapes, right? Okay, just to doesn't really matter, shows up now here, and you can see it shows up in a non-boxed fashion. It's very interesting to see that the gray background was really baked into this, and this you can just delete it. And then what we have now is we have this brush that you can use. So this is me holding down the brush, and this is me just putting the tip down once. So as you can see, yeah, does it work? Yes, but it's really not usable in any capacity. It's just really boring. Well, this is kind of cool, but yeah, as I said, surprises. Why is that? Because now what we're getting in terms of specification is just the basics that are always the same. So in terms of these layers to try out, you can just spam them. If you don't want them, just create a new one. You can delete them later, it doesn't matter. So now we go into the brush creator and then see what they've done to our brush by default. So by default, this is the spacing and this is the orientation. The orientation, you kind of drew it in and you don't really want it to change, else you would have turned it before, I guess. So that means this you can leave it alone. Now what happens here is, first of all, we want this to become a stroke, like from a pencil, and then that means is that we need it to open up a little bit, right? And also we need it to be smaller to see if it works. So I just changed the spacing, I changed the size. Now you may change the size because the cliche is already defined with that pixel count. If you now change the size, that doesn't matter. So we changed it, and what did we get? We got something like this, which is already better. It's not perfect, and it's just miles away from what we want, but it is becoming a brush slowly. So what we now have to do is to get other specifications active. So there's a lot here, and you'll probably think, oh my god, I will never understand these. But it's easier than you think, trust me. So what you need is not actually that many. You need, most of the time, you need the shape dynamics and the transfer. Yeah, let's say these two. The smoothing is just a linear option. You put it on, you get anti-aliasing, that's it, right? So you leave that on always. That doesn't matter. It does not have, see, if I go in there, there's a sub menu. Smoothing does not have a sub menu. It's a linear setting, right? So most of that scattering, texture, color dynamics, noise, pose, edges. Some of these down there, underneath here, where you see down here, they all linear choices, and they're mostly legacy stuff like wet edges when they wanted to do watercolor stuff or something. You don't need that usually, so let's ignore that for now. This will be this tutorial. I want it to be how to create 90% of the brushes, which you only need these two settings. The other setting for more advanced that is really interesting is the dual brush. And what the dual brush is, very briefly, is just a brush inside a brush. Like you use the cliche of the one brush as a container for a second brush cliche. That's what that is, but this needs a lot of tinkering and a lot. You can try it out for hours and hours and hours and then maybe get something good and maybe not, right? So this is not something I will explain today, but most of the brushes and most of other programs that are simpler, like a Procreate or something like that, they only have basically brushes that function like this, right? So let's change something so that we get closer to what we want. So first of all, we need to ask some questions. What do I want the brush to do in terms of shape? Because shape dynamics and transfer are just, you could say, transparency dynamics, right? So opacity and how the brush behaves in terms of strength and opacity. So the first question is, do we want there to be changes with the shape? And the answer to that is yes, because I don't want to put the brush like this and then have everybody immediately see that this is just a boring repetition of the same thing. So how do we get this out? Well, first of all, let's look at the settings. You have a size jitter, an angle jitter, and a roundness jitter. What do they mean? It's like a randomizer. So when you set the jitter higher, watch what happens down here. Now we have a jitter of 65%. What does that mean? Translated, in other words, that means every time the brush tip is put on the canvas, there is a 65% chance for it to have a random size. No, that was wrong actually. It will change every time it iterates. It will change size randomly from 0 up to 65%. So that is why you see that every iteration now here it's more inconsistent, because every time this brush repeats now it changes size, but you don't have any control over that. And that is the problem with the jitter setting, right? And the angle jitter is the same. However, this is pretty useful because already makes the brush less predictable, right? And that's what we're going for, is predictability and also readability, right? Excuse me. So what the best setting is to mask that something is repeated, in my opinion, is not even the size jitter, because I want the size to be fairly the same and maybe even react to my pen pressure a little bit. So for now, I will just have a minimum size jitter active, so that no matter what other settings I use, every time the brush is repeated, it changes size just a little bit to make it a little bit more irregular. And then the big thing now is the angle jitter. And as you crank this, you can see down there that every iteration of the brush tip, it turns in a random position. And the stronger you do this, the more it turns. But of course, if you have little speckles, there is a certain sweet spot amount that it turns before it just looks basically the same. And usually I found these sweet spots to be something like a 33% or like a 60-something%, and where you have maximum unpredictability basically. So you see that down there. It's now very hard, if you look at this stroke, to read from this stroke that it has been repeated at all, right? And that is what we want. Also, mind you that you can try it out live. So every time I change a setting, I can immediately try it out and see how it comes out. So now what happens is that it becomes less dense because the brush tip somehow it rotates, and that somehow makes distribution more evenly, makes it less dense. So we can just go back to the top here and then just select a different spacing. Now with the rotation active, you want maybe a tighter spacing, right? We'll put this down a little bit. So now you can see already changed. So once we're happy with that, we go back to the shape dynamics, and then we just tinker with this like in increments until we're happy. So now you could say, oh, this is a nice stroke. This could be really good. Okay, so now let's try this smaller, because it is meant to be a pencil stroke, right? Like this, or even smaller than that. Does it qualify? I would say it has a nice texturing to it. That could be a paper grain result, something like that. So yes, but the thing that it doesn't do and that we need to have is a opacity dynamic, right? So you don't expect the pencil stroke to be like an ink liner that is always the same strength when you put it down. We're not, the goal is not to emulate that. If that was the goal, then I think we would be almost done. Like for an inker, this is pretty cool. Like then you zoom in on that and you see that, yeah, this is not bad really. It's almost, it has something organic to it. So anyways, to get to the pencil, I'm making just a new layer here. We need the second specification that I said would be important to create 90% of your brushes, remember? And that is the transfer. And transfer, that just means how much of a tone is transferred to the canvas, I guess. Again, you have your jitters, opacity, flow. Flow is just a form of also iterating the brush tip. Make this bigger so you can see. So the flow jitter, what it does is it's a little bit like an opacity jitter. You can see that it's not a real difference in flow and opacity. And sometimes I think the flow is calculated differently. So every time the brush repeats, it's not exactly the same tone. It's maybe a little bit brighter, a little bit darker. And then on the opacity side, it's just very simple. That's just, there's less opacity or more opacity in every iteration of the stroke. Not of the stroke, sorry, of the brush tip cliche that it gets put down. So you can see that this one is slightly brighter than this one now. And if I was to make a stroke, you would zoom in there, you will see that they are not all the same darkness, right? So that helps with being more organic a little bit. Going to undo these. And then I mostly use opacity jitter. But there's something to be said about this, and that is the more jitters you use, the less control you have, because that just means that it will happen automatically, right? And you might not want that. And for the pencil, yeah, I want it to happen a little bit always, but then the rest of it, I want to control it. And how do I control, excuse me, anything at all? The only way to do that is by going into the control panel, and this also exists in other specifications. So the size jitter, we'll get back to that in a second, and the transfer, they have that same set of control features. So you can choose to have a jitter here, but you can also choose to control this via pen pressure, and that is what most people want. If I set this, there's a drastic change in the preview, and that is because now this assumes that we put the pen down 0%, and this in the middle assumes that it's 100%. So is now dependent on how much I push down with the stylus onto the Wacom board. So let's try this. I'm very soft, and then I push more, and that is the max I get, and then I let go of it. So this is what my hand was able to draw without just putting it down once, doing a stroke with different pressures, and then that's the result of that. So now what we have to do is we have to see if that is good enough, right? So again, I'm jumping between the three of these now more because I want to refine the brush more. So I'm going back to a size that is more akin to what I am aiming for, and you can see already this changes stuff a lot. Now if I draw without pressure, just pressure of my hand is what I mean by that, you can see it looks like this, and then if I put pressure it looks like this. So we can do kind of a crayon style. The pencil, it would have another thing, I think, and that is it would get thicker when I push down a little bit more. So two things I need to change. One is that the softness is really too soft for me now, and you can change that by setting a minimum opacity. So if you look over here, there's a minimum slider, also in shapes, diameters, angles, but here it's really useful because you can set now a minimum opacity. You can say no matter how soft, and you will see this show up here, right? No matter how soft, I always want 50% at least of opacity. It's a good idea to have because most of the media that you put it on paper that you want to emulate in digital drawing, they have a threshold, they have a minimum. It's not like you can paint a 1% ink stroke or a 1% pencil stroke reliably on paper, right? So therefore, I think it's better if that minimum is a little bit higher. So maybe let's go for 40%, and then I can go up to this. So now the minimum pencil stroke is this, the maximum is this. So that way I always have a decent amount of opacity on the canvas, and it gives me the feeling that, yeah, I have to commit a little bit, but that is really now a preference thing. If you like this more, then you go for that. But I recommend on most brushes not to use 0 as a minimum, because it will just make it everything so vague here, and then you might fall into the trap of just always drawing very vague and never committing. And I think that is something that the brush, you should kind of not have this option in the brush, if you know what I mean, right? So but today I have to cough a lot, I'm sorry. So yeah, about the shape, let's just get over here and then do the same. The size now, we have a little bit of a jitter, remember, that was here, but it's really not that much, so you cannot really see that, you just feel it, right? But now we want to add to that the control of having the brush pressure also influencing the diameter of the brush tip. So now you can see that is without a minimum, this is always the most extreme. It's from 0 to 100. And of course that is bullshit with a pencil, because no matter how sharp you have your pencil, right, it will never be the case that you will get an extremely thin line and then you push down more and you get a very thick line. So that will break the pencil, essentially. That's not a thing in pencils, therefore I will not put it. What I will put is I will put a high minimum, so that you start at a certain diameter and you can go a little bit thicker if you push down, and it will also get a little bit darker, like we said over here, with the pen pressure and then a minimum opacity, remember? So now adding to that is a minimum diameter of fairly high 70%. But what that means is that if I push less, I get this, and if I push more, I get this. So now you can play around with this. Maybe you want a little bit more. And then I would say, for my taste, this is pretty good. It's the spectrum between this thickness and that thickness. is enough for me. I don't want any more iteration, really. I'm usually a guy, I don't need everything to be so dynamic. I like to commit, right? So I will keep this diameter maybe even higher, maybe 65%, because also what you have to think is that you're not using this brush in this size. You will probably never do this. What you will do is you will use it like this is the maximum probably for a pencil, right? And then you will also always use it, you will use it even smaller. You will use usually like a 10 pixel or not even that. Something like this now. So now, if we do a little sketching with this, you can see if that works or not. So we put down a tree and then maybe a person. And then we'll see. We have the typical pencil stuff. I could make the brush bigger now to just try to do some coloring, but then again that is not exactly the use case of a pencil, so I really like to keep it small. But you can see now if that works for you. For me, it's pretty good. It's fine. And I get the darkness, and then I get also some lighter strokes over here. Draw some birds maybe. Right, so yeah, I think that's not too bad. Some shadow, and then, but there's also different styles of pencils, of course, so you have to decide for yourself if you like that or not. But that would be my recommendation. This this works fairly well, so in this case I want to keep it. And now there is a thing that you cannot mess up, and that is, if you want to keep this, you cannot change just to brush again, change back or just close this window. It will not save the specifications, right? So that is, you might be used to that, because nowadays most of the options they save automatically, not this one. So what you have to do if you want to keep this, and also not only think about whether you want what you want your basic brush size when you pick up the brush to be. In my case, it would be most likely a 7 pixel. So I'm going to set it to that, and then what you need to do is you need to go to the bottom right and have this little box ticked, create a new brush. And then that's why I said earlier, remember that the name does not matter right now, because there's no other way to save the brush than to just create a new brush from these settings that we just set, right? So I will now call this a pencil tutorial. Maybe I will use this pencil in the future. We'll see. I will say OK, hit OK, and now I can close this, can go back, and now it shows up here in my with my 7 pixels. And right next to the other brush by the test name, that is still unchanged. You see that? So in case you tinker for that for hours, don't forget to create a new brush from this. You will regret it. Now I just take that and then use it. Now let's compare it to another pencil I made earlier for myself. Same diameter. Actually, this works different in terms of diameter. But yeah. See how they can be very different, right? To be fair, I use this as a pencil sometimes, but was never really the goal here. So yeah, I might keep that and then just rearrange those brushes. So just like that, guys, we made a pencil brush. And now, of course, you need to use that for a little while, just like I did over here, to see how this really behaves. If you like it, you can also, remember, use this for an eraser, right? So take the eraser and then it will work just the same. You can then even make it bigger, use it as an eraser, and then go back to using it as a brush, and yeah, just go from there. So let's recap for a little. Don't be too confused by these settings, right? We just now have a very nice competitive pencil brush that we use only shape dynamics and transfer dynamics for it, right? I explained to you briefly that everything in the shape dynamics is self-explanatory. The size jitter, it varies size. The angle jitter, it varies angles, right? And this we have it on, but it's not really very strong. And then that is just to turn the brush tip by iteration, right? You can put more stuff on control via pen pressure, but here's why this is not a good idea. It's because you can only intuitively have so many things happen when you put pressure to the pen. And I think the maximum of that is to increase opacity and to increase size a little bit, just the way we did it here. And then there's really the thing, what else do you want with your pen pressure? Because let's say I put a control for the angle on pen pressure. That means I put more, then the iteration of the brush, it turns more. Now how am I going to control this in conjunction with already having opacity as a control mechanism and already having diameter as a control mechanism? It doesn't work, right? So don't put too much control stuff on one control option like pressure, right? I would not do this. It's better to have some stuff happen randomly and then really be in control of just opacity and diameter of the brush. That's what I recommend. Then of course, I explained briefly, yeah, you have a jitter of the flow, which is sort of the same or similar to the opacity jitter. For now, we'll disregard that. This was meant to show you how to make a lot of brushes by very simple means. And I think, not exaggerating, that 80% or 75% of all the brushes I ever used, you can make it with inside of these 2-3 specifications, right? And then of course the top here is always the general stuff. You can turn and flip stuff, and that is also something, by the way, you can do it here in the shape dynamics. Very briefly, we don't need to save this, right? But if you were now, this is just so that you can see what happens. In the shape dynamics, you can say flip the X and flip the Y axis, right? So that means you're putting more randomization on the iteration of the brush tip. So every time it repeats, it might flip X axis on random, and it might also flip Y axis by randomly. So it mirrors itself basically to create even more iterations. This could be a good idea if you like that. It will not dramatically change the outcome, but I think I have it on sometimes. It's fine to have it on, right? So the roundness is very simple. It, like a disc that your brush tip is projected on, it will just skew that disc to an ellipse that is sharper and sharper if this is if that setting is higher, right? You can see like here it squishes it a lot, but I mostly never use this because that messes with the resolution, the perception of detail of the original brush cliche that I drew, that I want to show up, and it makes it so that here you perceive much more detail than in the next iteration, and in most cases I think this is terrible, is a terrible look, so I don't do this usually. But there is maybe an argument of using a little bit of it, right, to have even more randomization in there. So that's pretty much it. Now, with that being said, I hope I didn't forget anything. Maybe next time we'll create a different brush. Let me know what you think about that. So for now, we have a pencil. I hope you can recreate it. Hope you enjoyed that process. Hope you also understood it and realized it's not actually that difficult. So I hope this helped you at all. I hope you understood how those specifications work, how brushes work. As I said before, you can pretty much do a similar process in most of the Photoshop clones that are out there. It's not, shouldn't be an issue. Maybe some stuff is called differently, but it's really the same idea, and they work practically the same. So guys, let me know what brushes you want to create. Also, in terms of, it's just a little bit too early for me to do the 1,000 subscriber video. I'm just curious because I don't want to go down in count again and then be like, oh shit, right? So guys, thanks for the support so far. Talk to you next time. See you.